Noon in Dustvile Gulch carried a kind of silence that weighed on the air, the kind that felt like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But that day, the stillness changed. Down the red dirt road, a plume of dust began to rise, thick, steady, like the breath of some great beast drawing near. The stable boy outside the blacksmith shop saw it first. He threw up a hand to shield his eyes, then shouted, his voice cracking in the dry heat. "Rider coming in!" The words rolled through the town like a spark. Men left their work. Women peered from windows. A few children darted down the street, chasing the echo of hooves striking hard earth. When the dust thinned, they saw him. 6 horses, all silver-coated and broad across the chest, the kind of stock only a man with deep pockets could afford. Leading them was a figure in a gray duster, brim of his hat pulled low, sitting straight in the saddle. One hand on the reins, calm as if the animal beneath him were part of his own body. Garrett Kane. No one in Dustville had ever heard that name, but they didn't need to. One look was enough to know he wasn't a drifter. He didn't carry the swagger of a showy cowboy, but something quieter, something that made folks step aside. Every measured step of his horse stirred thin curls of dust, and with each one, more eyes followed. Garrett stopped at the blacksmith's, said a few low words, then rode on toward the heart of town. His gaze moved slow, deliberate. A shopkeeper wiping her window, a drunk slumped beside a barrel, a crooked for sale sign swinging in the wind. He took it all in, but not a flicker of expression crossed his face. Across the street, Rosalie Finch was already waiting. Folks called her the beauty of Dustville, not for kindness, but because no man could pass her twice without looking again. She wore a cream lace dress, a small parasol resting lightly in her gloved hand, blonde hair pinned high to show the pale curve of her neck. When Garrett drew near, she tilted her head, smile slow and practiced. She knew how to catch eyes and how to hold them. But Garrett didn't stop. He only gave her a polite glance before his eyes landed elsewhere, just a few paces off, in front of the general store. A woman was struggling with a sack of flour nearly half her size. Her dress was plain, dark, frayed at the hem, sleeves rolled to the elbow, showing sun-browned skin and faint calluses. Her dark curls were tied back, a few loose strands clinging to her damp neck. When she tried to lift the sack onto the step, her foot slipped on the fine layer of dust, and her balance gave way. Garrett dropped the reins and stepped down. He caught the sack before it hit the ground, steadying both the load and her. His hand was firm, unhurried. She looked up, and for an instant their eyes met. His, cool gray and unreadable. Hers, startled and bright. The sounds of the street seemed to fade. "Thank you," she said softly, clear despite the dust. "I wasn't careful." "It happens," Garrett replied, setting the sack on the step. "Road slick. Anyone could have slipped." She nodded, pulling her hand back, breath still quick. He tipped his hat, just a small motion, then turned away. No introduction. No charm. Yet the way he looked at her, direct, without judgment or pity, made Maren Carter feel, for the first time in years, that someone had truly seen her. As Garrett climbed back into the saddle, Rosalie Finch stood frozen on the porch, her fingers whitening around the handle of her parasol. The crowd murmured. It was all anyone could talk about. Garrett Kane, the stranger with silver horses and the face of a man who'd seen too much, had walked past the most admired woman in town to help the black woman who worked in the general store. By sundown, the story had spread through every corner of Dustville, from the saloon to the stables, even up to the church on the hill. They said he was a wealthy rancher, a man expanding his land across 2 counties. They said he'd come to buy the property by the creek, the same land owned by the Finch family. And they laughed as they repeated the tale, how the new land baron had stooped to help the Finch girl's black servant. But by then, Garrett Kane was already gone from sight, dust still rising behind him, and Marin Carter still standing in the doorway, her heart beating just a little too loud for reasons she couldn't yet name. Dusk fell over Dustville like a worn-out curtain dyed in burnt copper. By the time Garrett Kane rode through the broken gate of the Finch ranch, the last streak of sunlight had caught along his horse's flank, glimmered silver, then vanished into the dust. The gate sagged on rusted hinges, and the sign reading Whisper Creek Ranch hung crooked between 2 splintered posts. He paused in the yard, dry grass underfoot, a silence that felt too heavy for the hour. The house stood ahead, tired and proud in the same breath, like a relic clinging to its former dignity. Rosalie Finch appeared on the porch, a burst of color in a place long drained of it. Her red dress swept across the warped boards, her golden hair curled soft against her shoulders, and in her hand she held a fan that snapped open like a declaration. "Mr. Kane," she called, her voice smooth as warm wine. "What an honor to have you here at Whisper Creek. My father will be delighted." Garrett tipped his hat in acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. Over her shoulder, he caught sight of another figure near the well, Marin Carter. She was hauling up a bucket heavy with water, her sleeves rolled high, sun-dark skin glistening with effort. Each movement was firm, practiced. The plain cotton dress she wore was worn at the seams, the curls at her neck damp with sweat. There was nothing ornate about her, yet the dying light seemed to rest gently upon her, as if it recognized something alive. Garrett dismounted, tied his horse, and followed Rosalie inside. The dining room was lit with a single lamp and a modest fire that cast weak, trembling shadows up the walls. At the head of the table sat Jedediah Finch, shoulders slumped, eyes red and veined, his once commanding frame bowed under years of debt and drink. "I hear you're buying land across the valley," he rasped, lifting a chipped glass of cheap whiskey. "Good for you. Plenty of ground here, just short on men with the guts to take it." Garrett's reply was calm. "I like quiet places." "Quiet?" Jedediah barked a laugh. "Son, the only things quiet round here are wind and whiskey. You'll fit right in." Rosalie sat close to Garrett, tilting her head so the lamplight caught the sheen of her hair. She spoke of St. Louis parties, of music halls, of men who begged for her dance, her voice painted with longing for bright lights far beyond this dusty edge of the world. Garrett listened, but his eyes were elsewhere, on Marin, who emerged from the kitchen carrying a platter of roasted meat. She moved without hurry, setting each plate before them, her motions steady and sure. She said nothing, only adjusted a dish here, split a slice of cornbread there, and when her stepfather reached for more whiskey, she quietly replaced the bottle with a pitcher of water. No one noticed, except Garrett. "This smells fine," he said after a pause. Rosalie's smile brightened, eager. "You're too kind, Mr. Kane." He cut in gently. "I reckon the credit goes to Miss Carter, doesn't it?" The fan in Rosalie's hand stilled mid-sweep. Her glance flicked toward the woman by the stove. "Just something my mother taught me," Marin said, voice low. calm. Keep the flame steady. Too hot, and it burns outside while the inside stays raw. Garrett's mouth curved. A rare smile, brief but real. Keeping a steady flame's the hardest part. Worth learning, though. Rosalie looked between them, jealousy threading through her like a fine wire, invisible, sharp, and cutting. The rest of the meal passed in stilted pauses. Jedediah's head drooped over his plate, muttering nonsense through the haze of liquor. Rosalie filled his glass again and forced a brittle laugh, while Garrett stayed polite but distant. His mind wasn't there. It lingered at the edge of the room, where Marin quietly gathered plates, her calloused hands moving with quiet grace. When dinner ended, Rosalie helped her father upstairs, then returned to the porch. The night air smelled of dry wood and faint rain. "Mr. Kane," she said, leaning against the railing, her tone soft with intent. "This town is dreadfully dull. You'll tire of it soon enough." "Maybe," Garrett replied, adjusting his hat. "But there's something here worth staying for." "Something?" Her voice lifted, curious, almost hopeful. He gave a faint smile. "Hard to say yet." His gaze brushed past her, not unkindly, but without weight, and came to rest on the window behind her. Marin stood inside, washing the tablecloth, sleeves rolled, head bent to her work. "Thank you for supper, Miss Finch," Garrett said quietly. "I'll be back." Rosalie's smile widened, radiant, certain those words were meant for her. But as Garrett stepped off the porch, his boots paused at the threshold where Marin stood framed in lamplight. Their eyes met again, wordless, steady. Something unspoken moved between them, fragile but undeniable, like the tremor before a storm. When the sound of hooves faded into the night, Marin reached up and turned down the lamp. The house fell into darkness. Rosalie remained on the porch, her fan limp at her side, listening to the wind slip through the broken fence posts. Inside, the scent of smoke and whiskey lingered, but beneath it, faint and stubborn, was something new. A shift in the air. A breath of change she could not name, only feel. And she hated it. The morning after a brief night's rain, the wind swept across the fields as if it meant to erase the past. The grass was slick with dew, the smell of wet earth rich and sharp, and the clouds drifted low over the hills. At the northern edge of the Finch Ranch, where a stretch of fence had fallen since last winter, Marin Carter worked alone. She carried a spade, a hammer, a few rough planks, and a coil of wire rope slung across her shoulder. Sweat darkened her cotton blouse, but she didn't stop. Each swing of the hammer came steady, deliberate, not hurried, not weak. A rhythm that said this land still belonged to her, whether anyone cared to believe it or not. When hoofbeats sounded in the distance, she straightened, one hand tight on the handle of her tool. Through the haze of morning light came a tall rider on a gray horse, coat dusted, posture calm, every motion unhurried, as though he'd known exactly where he was headed. Garrett Kane reined in near the fence and tipped his hat. "You shouldn't be doing this kind of work alone," he said, his voice low and even. Marin wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "If I don't, who will?" Garrett didn't answer right away. He dismounted, unbuttoned his long duster, folded it neatly, and hung it over a fence post. Beneath it, the coarse shirt clung to a frame built by years of labor. Broad shoulders, sun-darkened arms, the kind of strength that came from earning one's keep. He picked up the spare shovel stuck in the weeds, tested its weight. then began digging a post hole with the ease of a man who'd done it all his life. Marin meant to protest, but when she saw his aim and depth were just right, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "You know your way around the land, don't you?" Garrett smiled without looking up. "Grew up on it. Folks say if you listen close enough, the earth'll talk back." "The earth out here doesn't say much," she replied, her tone light yet edged with challenge. "It just takes. And if you can't handle it, it'll swallow you whole." Garrett paused, meeting her eyes. "And you can handle it?" Marin leaned on the hammer, gaze steady. "I don't have the luxury of not handling it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the hum of wind moving through grass, the rasp of wire tightening, the dull clang of metal on wood. When she reached to knot the rope around the post, Garrett held the other end steady. Their hands brushed, rough, warm, firm, just long enough to halt them both. She pulled away first, her voice catching faintly. "You don't have to do that. I'm used to it." Garrett's hand lingered on the beam. His eyes narrowed slightly against the sun, but a faint smile softened his face. "Maybe I'm used to it too. Still, things go smoother with two." They fell into a rhythm. Each time she turned, he was already there, shifting the weight, setting the post, straight, as if they'd worked side by side for years. The wind grew stronger, carrying the scent of damp grass and distant water. After a while, Garrett set the hammer down, peeled off his gloves, and looked out over the wide valley. "Good soil," he said quietly. "With steady water, this could feed 100 head." "It could," Marin replied, her voice warming as she spoke of what she knew best. "But summers are cruel. Whisper Creek dries up till all that's left are muddy pools. I've been trying to dig small ditches to keep the rainwater longer, but Jedediah doesn't think it'll work." "He doesn't believe you?" "No one does," she said, smiling faintly. "Rosalie says prettier things, and people like prettier things." She looked away, lips pressed tight, though something uncertain flickered behind her eyes. Garrett bent to his task again, the hammer ringing in steady blows that echoed across the open land. Marin steadied the post, and again their fingers brushed. Longer this time, deliberate neither of them knew by whom. The sound of her breath mingled with the wind. For a while they said nothing. Only the rhythm of the work spoke, the hammer's beat, the rustle of grass, the pulse of earth itself. When the last plank stood firm, Garrett leaned against the post, removed his hat, and wiped his brow. The sun was slanting low now, painting their shoulders in the bronze of late afternoon. "You really shouldn't be doing this alone," he said again. "You've told me that," Marin replied, half smiling through fatigue. "But I've lived here all my life. If I waited for someone's help, that fence would have rotted years ago." Garrett chuckled, a sound deep and genuine, his first in days. "Well, today you didn't have to wait." Marin looked at him, this stranger with dust on his boots and kindness he tried to hide, and for the briefest moment, she forgot how heavy the land could feel. Dustville was always quiet after the morning winds, but that quiet had never meant peace. It was the kind of silence that carried the weight of things unsaid, of whispers that slipped beneath porch railings, drifted between saloon tables, hid among the store shelves, and echoed softly even in church pews come Sunday morning. They spoke of Garrett Kane, the man from the Western Valley, wealthy, reserved, the sort of stranger who made people look up when he passed. But what they spoke of more than him was the woman he had chosen to look at. He didn't take a liking to Rosalie Finch? No, replied the shopkeeper, half sympathetic, half amused. I saw it myself. He helped the dark one, right in the middle of town. Laughter followed, quick and cutting. The talk spread like wildfire across dry prairie grass. In a place like Dustville, that kind of talk was a storm. Rosalie Finch heard it first at the dressmaker's. She entered in a spotless white gown, smiling as two women fussed over fabric. But when she turned her back, one whispered, "Such beauty," and still she couldn't hold his eye. The other murmured, loud enough to be heard, "Seems Mr. Kane prefers a woman who works over one who talks." Rosalie froze, the smile on her lips turning to glass. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" The two only glanced at each other, pretending confusion, then went on choosing fabric. Rosalie left in a rush, her skirt sweeping up dust behind her. The afternoon sun burned bright, but it couldn't melt the fire gathering inside her, a humiliation too sharp to name. By the next morning, the whole town had heard. Marin Carter went to market early, as she always did. She carried a large basket, her sleeves rolled, a brown scarf tied at her wrist. The chatter of the market slowed when she appeared. It wasn't her color they noticed. They'd long grown used to that. But the whispers that followed her now. The sidelong glances. The words just loud enough to cut. Who does she think she is? That half-breed thinks she can climb right into the clouds. Marin heard, but didn't stop. She had learned silence was armor, learned to lower her head and walk on. But this morning, the armor felt heavier. She was paying for flour when the sound of hooves struck the ground behind her. Steady, familiar. She turned, and there was Garrett Kane, dust on his coat, his hat pulled low. He said nothing at first, only dismounted and stood beside her, hands in his pockets. The women who had been whispering turned away, suddenly very interested in the vegetables. Marin frowned. "What are you doing here?" Garrett's voice was calm. "I heard what they've been saying. I wanted to see if they'd say it to my face." She glanced around at the quiet market, then back at him. "You don't have to do that. Around here, the wind carries gossip faster than any horse." Garrett tilted his head slightly. "Then I'll make sure it carries the truth with it." They bought their supplies in silence. But it wasn't a cold silence. It was steady, warm, almost protective. Every now and then she looked up and met his eyes. Not pitying, not curious, but level and sure. And that simple kind of seeing made her pulse stumble, then race again. On their way back, the wind swept through the grass fields, tugging loose the scarf from Marin's neck. It fluttered up, catching on the breeze, and her hair blew wild in the sunlight. Garrett reached out, catching the scarf before it flew away. For a heartbeat, his hand brushed her hair, soft, sun-warmed, smelling faintly of soil and sage. "People will talk," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the road. "Let them," he said. "I never planned to live for their approval." Neither spoke again. But when they reached the ranch gate, both knew something had changed. What had started as gratitude, as respect, was turning into something far more dangerous and far harder to deny. That night, Marin sat by the kitchen fire, listening to the wind thread through the cracks in the walls. She knew the whispers hadn't stopped. She knew Rosalie's anger would grow, and Jedediah would not take kindly to what folks were saying. But somewhere beneath that fear, a quiet warmth stirred, fragile, alive. It frightened her, yet she could not turn from it. And across the ridge in his unfinished camp, Garrett stood on his porch, the night air cool against his skin. He could see the faint glow of a lamp still burning in the Finch house. He knew he was crossing a line between helping and wanting. But he also knew that once a man truly saw something, he couldn't pretend blindness again. The wind carried the distant rush of Whisper Creek and the scent of wet earth. Somewhere in that darkness, the rumors kept traveling. But like seeds buried deep in soil, a truer thing had already taken root, silent, unseen, and waiting for the season when the wind would finally turn. That afternoon, the sky over Dustville turned the pale yellow of an old cloth. Dry wind swept across the rooftops, carrying dust and the faint reek of liquor from the saloon down the street. Garrett Kane was about to mount and ride back to his ranch when the Finch stable boy came running, out of breath and clutching a small slip of paper. "Mr. Kane," the boy panted, thrusting the note forward. "Mr. Finch invited you to supper tonight. Miss Rosalie said she would be very pleased if you accepted." Garrett took the paper without a word. Rosalie's careful, slanted handwriting read, "My father looks forward to speaking with you about land and future cooperation." He was not the sort to be swept by polite invitations, yet he understood. An open refusal would only add fuel to rumor. So when dusk softened the hills, Garrett rode again toward Whisper Creek Ranch. The house welcomed him with the smell of strong drink. Jedediah Finch sat at the head of the table, shirt unbuttoned, a bottle of whiskey within reach. Rosalie, radiant in a pale green dress, came forward from the parlor with a practiced smile. "Mr. Kane," she trilled, "Dustville would be duller without a guest like you. Please sit." Garrett took his seat, courteous, his gaze skimming the room. A house once grand, now patched and cluttered. One thing he noted had not changed: the small, careful touches that spoke of a single, steady hand. He knew those hands belonged to Myron. Sure enough, minutes later she appeared with a tray of tea. Lamplight fell on her sun-dark face, where sweat and dust mixed into a plain honesty that softened something in Garrett. Rosalie went on talking, painting plans to restore the ranch, to bring in investors from Helena, to a new vision for Dustville. But each time Marin passed, Garrett's eyes followed. Her actions were quiet and certain. Every movement held the knowledge of the land, a knowledge Rosalie, despite her beauty and charm, had never needed. The front door burst open. A gust of dry air and the smell of horseflesh rushed in. A middle-aged man in a gleaming leather coat and unnaturally clean black boots stepped inside without invitation. "Sorry to interrupt," he said in a smooth, loud voice. "I heard Mr. Finch had company, but I reckon what I bring is more pressing than any supper." Garrett recognized him at once. Bart Slade of Helena, the land baron famed for buying parcels from debt-ridden farmers and reselling them at 3 times the price. Jedediah rose with a crooked smile. "Bart, long time. Sit. Whiskey?" Slade did not wait twice. He sank into a chair, removed his gloves, tapped the table. "I hear you are struggling with this ranch," he said slickly. "This dry season has been rough, yes? I have an offer, a solution that will benefit both sides." Marin stopped in the doorway and caught every word. Rosalie lifted an eyebrow and feigned interest. "What is your offer, Mr. Slade?" Jedediah asked, pouring more liquor. "Simple." Slade leaned back, voice oily. "I will buy Whisper Creek Ranch outright. Land, house, barns, the livestock for $800. Marin nearly dropped the tray. "800?" she blurted. "The Creekland alone is worth twice that." Slade glanced at her with a flash of contempt. And who are you to meddle in business, Miss Carter? Marin squared her shoulders, eyes steady. The only person here who knows what that creek is worth. It is not only water, it is the valley's lifeblood. Whoever controls Whisper Creek controls Dustville. Jedediah frowned, annoyed. Marin, you do not understand. I understand more than you think, she cut in, voice controlled but edged like a blade. If you sell this land, folks across the valley will have to buy water at whatever price Mr. Slade sets. When the dry season comes, they will choose between hunger and debt. We will be left with nothing but the shame of selling our lifeline. The room fell silent, except for the stove's faint crackle. Rosalie flushed, embarrassed for her father. Jedediah tightened his grip on the glass. Slade paused, then laughed, big and brittle. You speak well, Miss Carter. But this is a matter for men, for those who know the value of coin. I do not bargain with feeling. Garrett sat still, watching Slade, then Marin. She did not bow or tremble. She stood with her hand on the table, voice steady. Money will not make water, sir. And when the creek is gone, the land you buy will be dust. Slade's smile hardened. You speak boldly. I do not take kindly to black women telling me how to do business. Garrett rose slowly, his movement enough to change the air. Neither do I like men who prey on the drunk to rob others of their land, he said, voice low and heavy. Slade spun, his grin tightening. Mr. Kane, I was only talking business. Then take your business elsewhere, Garrett replied, eyes cold as iron. Jedediah looked around, flustered. Now come on, don't make a mountain of a molehill. But Marin would not step back. She put a hand on her stepfather's arm, softer now, but no less firm. Father, my mother and I planted fields along Whisper Creek. I promised her I would not let anyone take this land. Please do not sell. Jedediah hesitated. In the clouded, liquor-softened gaze, a flicker of sense returned. He set down his glass and sighed. All right. We are not in a hurry. Slade sprang up, fury flushing his face. You have made a mistake, Miss Carter. You and whoever stands by you. I will not forget this. He snapped on his hat, voice low and threatening. Out here, men who block my path do not live at ease for long. The door closed behind him, leaving the smell of smoke and bitterness. Marin stood still, hands clenched. Garrett moved near, his look a blend of quiet and warmth. You know he will come back? He asked. She nodded, voice soft. I know. But for now, the land still belongs to my mother. Garrett was silent. He had never met anyone like her. No weapons, no wealth, yet standing unbowed among those who could crush her. His gaze met hers, and in the gray of his eyes she saw something uncommon. Not pity, not admiration, but respect. Rarer than gold in that country. From the porch, Rosalie peered through a crack in the door, and her heart chilled. The man she had schemed to win. He looked at another woman that way. And out along the dusted trail, Bart Slade tightened his reins and let a thin, dangerous smile play across his lips. A black woman dares stand in my way, he muttered. I will make her regret her mouth. Late in the day, as honey-colored light spread over the low hills of Dustville, the sound of hoofbeats drifted in from afar. Marin Carter lifted her head from the fence she was mending and saw Garrett Kane approaching on his silver-gray horse. He stopped in the yard, the last rays of sunlight brushing his weathered face, revealing a faint, rare smile. Miss Carter, he said, voice low as the wind. I just finished working the land west of the creek. I'd like you to take a look, if you've got the time. Marin wiped her palms on her skirt, hesitating. I can't imagine anyone wanting me as their guest. Not a guest, Garrett replied, his gaze softening. Someone who understands the land better than I do. I could use your opinion. He extended his hand. For an instant, the breeze stilled. Only the quick beat of Marin's heart filled the quiet. She looked at his hand, broad, calloused, steady, then placed her own in it. Garrett drew her up, lifting her lightly onto the horse. Warmth passed through the worn fabric between them. His shoulders felt solid, unyielding as a wall. She sat in front of him, his arms loosely holding the reins, their closeness bound by the rhythm of the horse's stride. Each motion brought them closer still. His breath brushed her hair, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Careful, he murmured. The trail's steep here. Marin's voice came quiet as the breeze. I'm not afraid, as long as you don't let go. Garrett smiled, the corners of his mouth soft in the fading light. I've no intention of letting go. By the time the sun had sunk behind the ridge, they reached his new parcel of land, a small valley by Whisper Creek, where water ran clear over flat stones that caught the moonlight. Wild grass rippled green under the rising silver glow, and clusters of white flowers shimmered like scattered stars. Garrett dismounted and helped her down. He tied the horse beneath a willow, then turned to her, eyes calm. I'm planning to build a house here, he said quietly. Close to water, close to good ground. What do you think? Marin knelt, scooping a handful of earth. It was damp, fine-grained, alive. It's good soil, she said, lifting her gaze. If tended right, the grass will grow strong, and the creek won't dry when summer comes. Garrett watched her, something thoughtful in his expression. You listen to the land like it speaks to you. I've never seen anyone do that. A faint smile touched her lips. Maybe because there's no one else left for me to listen to. They sat together on the grassy bank where moonlight spilled across the water like molten silver. The creek's murmur mingled with the hum of crickets, shaping a peace neither of them had known in a long while. For a time they said nothing. Then Marin spoke softly. Do you ever get tired of proving yourself? Garrett tilted his head. I think everyone does, one way or another. Not like me. Her voice caught slightly. I have to prove I belong. Every day. Every look, every word reminds me the blood in my veins isn't the right color. At home, they call me a remnant of the past. In town, I'm the Black Carter girl. Out here, they say I work like a man. No one just sees me. Garrett stayed silent. In the dark water, he saw her reflection. The line of her face, the light of her eyes, the quiet ache that spoke louder than words. Marin, he said at last, I've met all kinds out here. Rich men, poor men, the loud, the silent, but I've never met anyone stronger than you. She gave a faint, sad laugh. You say that because you haven't seen me afraid. I have, he murmured. But you keep standing, even when you're afraid. That's what strength is. Marin looked at him, the moon softening the lines of his face. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, gentleness without pity. Her throat tightened, words refused to come. Garrett lifted a hand, brushing his fingers against her cheek. not to wipe a tear, but as if asking to cross an unseen line. She didn't pull away. His hand was warm as it rested against her skin, then moved slowly, pausing above her heartbeat. Moonlight spread across her brown skin like liquid gold. In that stillness, the world seemed to hold its breath. "I don't care what they say," he whispered, voice rough with honesty. "If they look at you and see something different, let them. I see one thing, someone strong, proud, and so beautiful this land itself falls quiet." Marin shook her head, but tears slipped free. "You don't understand, Garrett. I've learned not to trust kind words. They always carry pity." He tightened his hand around hers. "Then believe this. I don't pity you." Her breath trembled. "What are you doing, Garrett Kane?" "What I've been trying not to do for days," he said. "But I'm done fighting it." He leaned in, and the space between them vanished. The kiss came slow, almost hesitant, then deepened, warm and certain. The scent of earth, grass, and river water wrapped around them. The night fell utterly silent, broken only by the rhythm of their hearts and the murmur of the creek. Marin didn't pull away. Her hand slipped to his neck, feeling the rough heat of his skin. Moonlight shimmered across their joined silhouettes, doubled in the trembling surface of the stream. That night, beside Whisper Creek, they spoke no more. There was only quiet, no longer a barrier, but a confession. And when they finally left the creek, Garrett's silver horse carried them across the open field. Behind them, two sets of footprints pressed into the softened earth, trailing toward the water. A silent proof of the night when moonlight erased every boundary between them. That night, the wind changed. Hot, dry gusts swept in from the desert, dragging with them the taste of dust and the weight of heat. Over Dustville, a waning moon hid behind clouds, leaving the fields swallowed in darkness. Garrett Kane was checking the stables, his thoughts still echoing with the quiet warmth of the evening he'd spent beside the creek with Marin. He hadn't felt such peace in years, until the first trace of burning reached his nose. He froze. A faint red glare flickered against the horizon, the direction of the barn and the hay store. Then a shout tore through the night. "Fire! Fire at the stables!" Garrett bolted. The blaze had already climbed high, tongues of flame licking at the rafters, painting the sky in shades of blood and smoke. The horses screamed and kicked against the doors, trapped behind thick wood bolted from outside. The ranch hands ran in confusion, hauling buckets of water that the wind scattered before they reached the flames. The fire was alive, wild and hungry. "Forget the water! Open the doors first!" Garrett roared. His voice cut through the storm of panic. He hurled himself at the latch, shoulders slamming until the beam cracked. The door burst open, and a black stallion charged out, knocking him sideways. Garrett hit the dirt hard, but scrambled up, grabbing the reins, steadying the frightened animal, before turning back into the choking heat. Smoke stung his eyes, and the air seared his lungs. Somewhere through the chaos, he heard someone yell, "Has anyone seen Marin?" Then came the pounding of hooves from the ridge. Marin Carter rode like the wind, her chestnut mare tearing across the field, the sound of its strides lost in the roar of fire. Young Will Tanner had come pounding on her door, breathless with news of the blaze. By the time she reached the ranch, the barn was engulfed, the horses spilling out in terror. "No!" she shouted. "If they bolt for the valley, they'll go over the edge." She spurred her horse and plunged into the storm of sparks. The wind whipped her face raw, ash filled the air until she could barely see. Bent low in the saddle, she followed the silhouettes of the fleeing herd, the fire's red reflection flashing across their flanks. One young colt stumbled, sliding down the slope with a desperate cry. Marin leapt from her horse, grabbed its mane, and dug her heels into the dirt. The animal reared, striking wildly, but she held firm. "Easy now. Hush, easy," she rasped, her voice rough from smoke yet steady as a drumbeat. The colt trembled, then stilled, eyes wide but no longer wild. She led it back, calling softly to the rest. One by one, the panicked animals fell in behind her. It was a sight no one in Dustvale would forget. A lone black woman, small and fierce, riding through the burning night, leading the herd as the firelight turned her into something almost unearthly. From the town below, people had begun to gather, drawn by the blaze. They saw her come out of the dark, hair undone, dress torn by wind and cinders, voice hoarse but commanding as she guided the frightened horses home. The same townsfolk who once whispered behind her back now stood speechless, caught between awe and disbelief. Garrett had just freed the last of the animals when he looked up and saw her. Marin burst from the smoke, her mare at the lead, the herd trailing in perfect line behind her. "Good Lord," he muttered, hardly trusting his own eyes. She stopped at the gate, slid down from the saddle, and nearly collapsed. Garrett ran to her, catching her just as her knees buckled. Her breath came in ragged bursts, shoulders shaking. I got them back," she gasped. "They didn't go over." Garrett couldn't speak. He cupped her face in both hands. Ash streaked her hair and cheeks, but her eyes still burned, fierce, bright, alive. "You're out of your mind," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You could have died." Marin gave a weak laugh. "This land was my mother's. I couldn't let it burn." The wind picked up, scattering sparks through the air. The fire's dying glow danced across their faces, his lined and smoke-blackened, hers marked with soot, yet shining like tempered bronze. In that instant, Garrett saw no color, no status, no difference at all. Only the woman who had risked everything to save what he loved. He traced a thumb along her cheek where soot met tears. "You saved the ranch, Marin. You saved me." She started to answer, but the murmur of voices stopped her. People had crowded close now, clutching buckets and tools, their eyes wide. "She did it?" a man whispered. "She did," a woman replied quietly. "Brought the whole herd back. Never seen anyone ride like that." No one laughed. No one sneered. The same mouths that once spoke disdain now held silence. In the flickering light of the fire's last embers, Marin Carter, once dismissed as the black girl living under Finch's roof, stood tall. Her hands still trembled from exhaustion, yet her gaze was calm, steady as a flame that refused to die. Garrett's hand closed around hers. His grip was firm, unspoken. Something between them had changed. No longer the protection of one for the other, but the shared respect of two souls who had faced death and chosen to live. And as the wind carried the last sparks into the dark, Dustvale stood still, watching the woman who had walked through fire and come out shining. The moon was full, but its light no longer shone clean. Along the empty streets of Dustvale, a few oil lamps flickered weakly in the mist. At the edge of town, the saloon called Silver Spur stayed open late for land brokers and wanderers too restless to sleep. Outside, a black carriage waited, polished to a dull gleam under the yellow haze. A woman stepped down, her blue silk skirt whispering across the dirt. A hooded cloak hid her golden hair. but her eyes still caught the lamplight. Sharp, restless, too bright to belong to peace. Rosalie Finch paused before the door, drawing one long breath as if to swallow the last of her hesitation. Then she went inside. The air was thick, smoke, whiskey, and the weary noise of men who had forgotten to care. At the back table sat a man alone, dark leather coat, gloves folded neatly beside a half-empty glass. Bart Slade didn't need to look up to know who had arrived. "Miss Finch," he said, voice smooth as a whetted blade. "Didn't think you'd have the nerve to show." Rosalie pulled back her hood, the lamplight catching the perfect lines of her face. "It isn't nerve," she said. "It's exhaustion." Slade's brow lifted. "Exhaustion with what?" "With being in that house," she said bitterly, "where everyone only sees her. She works in dirt and silence, yet they call her good. And me, they call jealous. They whisper that I can't measure up to a black girl." Slade chuckled, slow and satisfied. "I took you for a clever woman, Miss Finch. Didn't know you had fire in you." Rosalie's gaze hardened. "You want my family's land. I know. But what you really want isn't the house or the cattle. It's the water." The man's smile faded, eyes narrowing like blades drawn in the dark. "Go on." From her cloak, Rosalie drew a folded paper, an old map, yellowed with time. "Marin Carter's mother drew this," she said. "It marks an underground vein that runs deep beneath Finch land. It doesn't surface at the creek, but if you drill here—" Her fingertips circled a small mark. "You'll have water year-round, even in drought. That vein feeds directly into Whisper Creek." Slade stared at the map for a long moment, lamplight gleaming in his eyes like gold reflected on steel. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," she said, though her lips trembled slightly. "I saw her mother hide it after my father died. She swore she'd protect this land. I want it gone from her hands." Silence stretched, tight as a rope. Then Slade leaned back, crossing his arms with a predator's calm. "And what do you want in return?" Rosalie reached into her purse and laid down a wrinkled train ticket. "Enough money for this ticket and a new life in St. Louis. I won't stay in this miserable town another day." Bart nodded once and set a heavy leather wallet on the table. "You're sharper than I thought, Miss Finch. But tell me, aren't you afraid they'll find out?" Rosalie gave a fragile laugh. "People only see what they want to see, Mr. Slade. They'll see the same Rosalie Finch, sweet, gentle, pitiful. I'll let them, at least until the train leaves." He studied her, amusement glinting beneath the smoke. "I do admire a woman who knows how to use her beauty like a knife." "And I," she replied coolly, "use it only to climb out of the pit others dug for me." Slade tilted a bottle, pouring 2 glasses. A drink to seal the deal. The clear liquid shimmered as she lifted her glass. When they drank, Rosalie's eyes lingered on him. His slick composure, his cruel calm, the hands that had ruined lives without a tremor. In that moment, she realized she had sold not only Marin's secret, but the last decent piece of herself. Yet she didn't stop. Not when freedom waited only a train ride away. Outside, the wind began to howl. The tavern sign creaked on its chain, swaying in the gusts. When Rosalie stepped back into the night, Bart remained at the table, staring at the map with the cold gleam of triumph. At the next table, a young man pretending to read a newspaper lowered his hat brim. Will Tanner, Garrett's stable hand, watched long enough to see Slade fold the paper and slip it into his coat. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he rose and vanished into the night. The following morning, Rosalie packed her trunk. A new dress, white gloves, the same hat she'd worn to church last Easter. She looked once around her room, the faded wallpaper, the cracked mirror, the lace curtains her mother once mended. The mirror returned the face of a beautiful woman whose eyes no longer knew innocence. "St. Louis will be different," she whispered. "No one will know who I was." Outside, the sun climbed slow over Dustville. Beneath the earth, Bart Slade's ambition had begun to wake. He now held the key, the location of the hidden vein that could drain the heart of Finch Land and choke Whisper Creek itself. Across the valley, Garrett and Marin knew nothing of what had been set in motion. They were rebuilding the stables, her hands still raw from the fire's wounds. Garrett bent to bandage them, his touch steady, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her sister quiet. "I think we can start over," Marin said softly. Garrett smiled. "We can, and this time no one will tear it down." But the wind shifted, carrying a distant sound, the long, lonely whistle of the early train. It cut through the morning air like a warning. In the carriage window, Rosalie sat with her gloves folded in her lap, the heavy purse beside her. The town receded behind her, turning to dust and shadow. Her eyes stared blankly at the passing planes, and as the train lurched forward, a single tear slipped down her cheek, perhaps regret, perhaps fear, and vanished into the rhythm of the rails. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Bart Slade unfolded the map again, a thin smile cutting across his face. "It's time," he murmured. "That black woman won't even see what hit her." Dawn came slow that morning. The first light seemed caught between the hills, held back by the fog curling over Whisper Creek. The air was damp and heavy, so still that Garrett Kane could hear the creak of his saddle leather as he tightened the reins. Down below, the creek wound like a silver thread through the valley. Once the lifeline of the Finch Ranch, now the target of a man's greed. Bart Slade had sent his men before sunrise. Their plan was simple and brutal: set charges along the underground spring, collapse the rock bed, and bury the water that fed every acre for miles. Garrett knew because Will Tanner had overheard everything. The meeting at the Silver Spur, the bribe, the betrayal. When Will told him, Marin had gone quiet. She didn't weep. She simply loaded the Sharp's rifle and said, calm and cold, "We'll be waiting for him there." They moved like shadows through the sagebrush and the low pines. Garrett led, Marin close behind, followed by Will and old Edgar, the stable hand who'd lived through 2 droughts and 3 fires. The 4 of them took position on the ridge overlooking the narrow ravine where the water glimmered faintly between rocks. From up there, they could see Slade's men at work, rough shapes moving in the haze, setting powder, stacking crates. 4 by the spring, Garrett murmured. 3 more holding the horses up top. Slade's not here yet, but they've got enough dynamite to bury this whole valley. Edgar nodded grimly. If they blow it, the water'll sink back underground. The ranch will dry and die. Marin pressed her eye to the rifle scope. The rising sun glinted off the barrel, washing her skin in bronze. A strand of windswept hair clung to her cheek. Garrett looked at her for just a moment, heart caught between fear and something harder to name. "You don't have to shoot," he whispered. Without turning, she said quietly, "You taught me to pull the trigger. Let me prove I learned." Garrett swallowed and gave a short nod. Below, the outlaws laughed as they worked. One big man with a tangled beard crouched by the rocks, fixing the fuse into a leather satchel. "All ready," he shouted. "Just wait for Mr. Slade's word." Garrett motioned with 2 fingers. Spread out. Take cover. They slipped along the ridge, crouching behind cacti and jagged stone. Beneath them, the creek murmured, steady and low, the sound of a heartbeat before battle. Hoofbeats rolled in from the distance. Slade appeared at last, riding a black horse, dust rising around him like smoke. His coat gleamed with wealth, his face with cruelty. He reined in beside the spring and smirked. "Do it," he ordered. "End this little game today." The bearded man bent toward the fuse. Garrett raised his hand. Marin's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder. A burst of fire split the morning. Her shot struck the powder bag before the fuse could catch. An explosion of dirt and smoke hurled the men backward, scattering their gear. Birds screamed from the trees. "Ambush!" one of them yelled, but his gun barely cleared its holster before Will's Winchester barked from the other side. Edgar's revolver joined in, the sharp rhythm echoing off the canyon walls. Bullets whipped through dust and sunlight, snapping bark and kicking up stone. Slade yanked his horse around, shouting, "Fall back! Get out!" Panic broke them. The hired guns dropped their weapons and ran for the horses, scrambling over rock and brush. Within seconds, the place was a haze of smoke, echoing hoofbeats and fading curses. Garrett slid down the slope, boots skidding on gravel, until he reached Marin. She still held the rifle steady, shoulders trembling with the recoil. Sunlight caught in her eyes, turning them to steel. "That was a fine shot," he said softly. She breathed hard, the corner of her mouth lifting. "Didn't do it for glory. Just didn't want you dying of thirst." He laughed under his breath, and for a heartbeat the whole world went still. No gunfire, no wind, just the mingled sound of their breathing and the whisper of the creek that had almost been lost. By noon, Dustville was humming with the story. Folks said the black woman from Finch Ranch had fired the shot that saved the valley. They said Garrett Kane stood beside her like a husband defending his wife. Within hours, whispers turned to legend. At the saloon, men raised glasses to her name. At the church, old women murmured that the Lord had sent her to guard the water. Bart Slade was gone, vanished with the sunrise, leaving behind his burned-out dynamite and the bitter promise of revenge. The next morning, when Garrett and Marin returned to the ranch, the front door of the Finch house stood open. Jedediah sat on the porch, an empty bottle dangling from his hand. His face looked older than the dawn. He didn't raise his head as he spoke. "Lord help me," he whispered. "I've lost both my daughters." Marin stood behind him, her chest tight. She said nothing. On the porch step, half hidden in the dust, lay half of a torn train ticket. She bent, picked it up, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket, a quiet farewell to everything broken. Outside, the wind rose, scattering leaves across the yard. Whisper Creek still flowed, its water cool and steady, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder, tears, and truth. The sky over Dustville burned the color of tarnished copper as the sun dipped behind the ridges. Faint light spilled across the old Finch house, catching on warped boards and windows dulled by dust. For days it had been silent there, a house of sighs and ashes. But tonight, that silence was about to break. From far off, hooves pounded the hard dirt, echoing against the hills like ghosts refusing to rest. Marin stood by the doorway, her hands still streaked with mud from the fields. Garrett Kane had just come in from the stables, sweat glinting on his brow. He heard the riders first and frowned. Not my men, he muttered, eyes fixed on the gate. Through the curtain of dust, 3 riders appeared. In the center rode Jedediah Finch, pale and rigid in the saddle. Beside him, on a gray horse, came Rosalie, her once fine dress torn and dirty, hair tangled, eyes swollen from weeping. The proud shimmer she'd worn like a crown was gone. Marin said nothing. She only stepped aside and opened the door. Inside, light filtered dim through the worn curtains. Jedediah lowered himself into the old rocking chair, his breath ragged. "Found her at the South Station," he rasped. "Hadn't a cent left. Nobody'd give her a ride. If I hadn't brought her back, she'd have starved by the road." Rosalie stood trembling in the center of the room, slim and small and shaking with cold and shame. Her eyes blazed through tears as they met Marin's. "You've won," she said hoarsely. "The whole town loves you now. You're their hero, and me? I'm the traitor. They don't know you stole everything. My place, my name, my family, even him." Marin set the rag down slowly on the table. Her voice came soft, tired, but steady. "Rosalie, I never took anything from you. I only tried to keep what was left of Mother and this land." Rosalie gave a bitter laugh. "Your mother," she spat. "Not mine. She left you her color and her pity, and the world's been soft for you ever since." Garrett stepped forward, his tone firm. "That's enough, Rosalie." She whirled on him, eyes wild. "And you! You were mine first, weren't you? You came for me, and then you looked at her like she's the only soul worth saving in this cursed town. I saw it in your eyes." "I came here for land," Garrett said quietly. "I stayed for the one who could hold it with her heart." Rosalie's laugh cracked, dry as wind scraping tin. "Her heart? You think this town will stomach a white man and a black woman? You think this is love? You're just saving her so you can feel righteous." Marin's eyes closed briefly, as though each word were a cut. Then she lifted her head, calm and grave. "You can hate me all you want, Rosalie, but don't say I never loved you. When Mother died, I swore to protect you. I kept that promise, even after you sold our land. I begged Garrett to find you." Rosalie froze. Tears welled again. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you're still my sister." Silence filled the room, broken only by the wind sighing through the cracks and the slow creak of Jedediah's chair. The old man raised his head at last, eyes clouded and weary. "She's right," he said, voice rough. "It's on me. My drinking, my weakness. I let both of you drown in it. I let greed make enemies out of daughters." Rosalie flinched as if struck. Her fingers clutched at her torn skirt, her face twisting under the weight of humiliation. "So that's it," she whispered. "You choose her. Everyone chooses her." "No one's choosing anyone," Marin said softly. "We're just living with the choices we made." Rosalie drew a sharp breath and broke down, sobbing. The sound tore through the room, raw, childlike, echoing off the walls that had once held laughter. She dropped to her knees, hands covering her face. But when Marin stepped closer, she looked up again, her tears gone cold. "You pity me," she hissed. "Don't you touch me with those filthy hands." Marin stopped, her hand hanging in the air. Her eyes glistened, but her tone stayed gentle. "Not pity," she said. "Regret. Because you could have been good, Rosalie. If only you'd learned to see someone besides yourself." Rosalie rose, trembling. She looked around the house that had once been home, now just dust, ghosts, and the wreckage of pride. "I don't need anyone to see me," she whispered. "I just need to forget." She turned for the door. Garrett made a move to stop her, but Marin's small shake of the head held him still. Rosalie didn't look back. Her skirt brushed the step as she crossed the porch and vanished into the red light of dusk. Jedediah pressed a hand to his forehead, leaning heavily on the chair arm. "She won't come back," he murmured. His voice was brittle with age and sorrow. Marin's gaze lingered on the doorway, her words barely above a breath. "Maybe that's for the best." Outside, the last of the sunset faded to ash, and the Finch house settled again into silence, not of peace, but of endings. Spring returned to Dustville like a benediction. That afternoon, sunlight poured across the valley like honey. The townsfolk came, not from curiosity, but respect. Once they had whispered against her name. Now they brought baskets of wildflowers, loaves of bread, and bottles of apple wine, humble gifts, freely given. On the porch, Garrett waited in a dark coat and crisp white collar, the old silver watch of his late father tucked in his vest. When the slow notes of a fiddle began to rise from the yard, Marin stepped outside. She wore no veil, no lace, no flowers in her hair. Her dress was plain cream cotton, trimmed with soft brown ribbons, fitting her frame with quiet grace. Each step she took seemed to bridge the years between what had been lost and what now endured. Sunlight broke across her bronze skin, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. Garrett descended the steps and extended his hand. "I thought I'd seen all the beauty this land could offer," he said, voice low, almost unsteady, "until you walked toward me." Marin's smile was gentle, grounded. "You've never been one for sweet words, Garrett Kane." He shook his head slightly. "Don't need to be. Every word I say is true." The ceremony took place beside the white fence freshly painted, under the great elm that had withstood decades of storms. No priest, no choir, only Judge Harrow, the same man who had once presided over Slade's trial. He smiled as he looked at them. "You two came through a battlefield to stand here. I can't think of any vow stronger than that." Garrett took Marin's hands, roughened by work, yet steady as stone. "I choose you," he said softly, his voice meant for her alone. "Not for how you look, not from pity, but for the strength you carry in your heart. You remind me who I am, and what's worth fighting for." Her eyes shone like the creek reflecting the wide blue sky. "And you've given me what no one ever dared to, the faith that I am worthy of love." When they slipped the slender silver rings onto each other's fingers, the wind rose, carrying laughter and blessings through the air. Some wept, not for romance, but because they knew Dustville had been washed clean of years of division by two souls once told they did not belong. That night, Dustville slept in peace. No more rumors, no more dividing lines, only the quiet fields under starlight and a house on the ridge. On the porch sat two figures, one white, one black, not as proof of difference, but of what endures beyond it. They didn't speak, because every word that mattered lived in the way their hands stayed clasped together. And when the wind carried the creek's soft song across the valley, Marin murmured, almost to the night itself, "True beauty doesn't live in color or form, but in courage, in grace, and in love built on respect." Garrett's fingers closed around hers, his gaze warm as a flame that would never die. "I know," he said, "and I see it. In you." Above Dustville, the stars burned bright, and beneath that porch roof, a new beginning was written. Quiet, steadfast, eternal as the water running through the earth.